but they wouldn't stay on them. So, there were tons of nasty side effects. These drugs were very toxic. There were a ton of toxic symptoms that these people, they did not want to take these drugs. They kept going off and then going psychotic. And I'm like, well, why are they doing that? Why are they wanting to go back to being crazy? I started asking them. Everyone on my caseload that went off the meds and went back to being insane, after they recovered and they put them back on their medications, I bring them in and ask them, why did you go off your meds? You know what happens when you do that. Do you want to be insane? Is that what you want? And they would say no. And I'd say, then why did you go off your meds again? Well, their answer was, I don't know. Over and over and over again. And that went on for 3 years, asking the same question, expecting some kind of sane answer. But the answer was, well, I don't know. Not only was that going on, virtually all of them at some point went off their meds and went back to being psychotic again. So that didn't make any sense. And there were a number of other things that didn't make any sense. Is one that I noticed that the voices were running patterns. And one of the first patterns I saw was that the voices were consistently, irreversibly negative. They never said anything positive. It was always negative stuff. You're no good, you're stupid, you're ugly, nobody likes you, you're going crazy, people are plotting behind your back. It was all nasty, mean, negative stuff. And it was like, if they're hallucinations, why was it just negative? Why weren't they random like all other hallucinations? Why weren't they all over the place? Why weren't some positive? Why weren't some negative? Why weren't some neutral? No, that didn't happen. That's the MO for all other hallucinations I've ever experienced. And these consistently ran a negative pattern. The question became is what held them on a negative trajectory all the time? Why weren't they negative? Why weren't they all over the place? Why were they consistently negative? Right? But they were, and they still are. They from one side of the United States to the other, and now I'm working with people all over the Western world. The voices are consistently, irretrievably negative. There's nothing positive about it. And if there is a little bit of positivity, it's only to grab the victim's attention and trust, and then they turn around and they hit them in the back. That was the first pattern that I noticed with the voices. Second pattern was that they were consistently anti-religious. They didn't want the patient going to church. They didn't want them praying. They didn't want them reading the Bible. They didn't want them going to religious ceremonies. They wanted nothing to do with God and religion. And why would a hallucination do that? Those of you who are working with schizophrenics, it's right in front of your eyes. Ask them. One thing I saw was that psychiatry and psychology, for the most part, didn't talk to these people. They just went, oh, they're hallucinating, their brains are broken, there's nothing that can be done for them except fill them full of drugs. Now, this is what the pharmaceutical industry wants you to believe. They want to sell drugs. Those drugs don't cure anything. They don't cure these people. They never have and they never will. What they do is they drug the brain. The voices are energetic entities. They are not physical. So what Big Pharma and the psychiatric mafia are doing is akin to if you had a very powerful magnet, you couldn't see that magnetic field. You can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it, you can't see it. For all practical purposes, it doesn't exist unless you get maybe a jar of iron filings and put it on the magnetic field, and then you'll see the magnetic field. The same thing happens with the voices. They are energetic. Thoughts are energetic. Memory is energetic. Feelings are energetic. Memory is energetic. They're not physical. The voices are not physical. You can't get rid of the voices by drugging the brain. The brain is like the radio receiver. It picks up thoughts. It's never asked in psychology or psychiatry where thoughts come from. They don't even deal with the issue because they can't. You can't measure that kind of stuff. There were a number of things that just didn't wash out when I was working at the state hospital. One of which was not only the voices running consistent patterns of negativity and going nuts when it comes to the person reading the Bible. I've had several patients tell me that the voices acted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan when the 23rd Psalm was read to them. Why would a hallucination do that? Those of you working with schizophrenics, try it. Have the patient repeat the 23rd Psalm and ask them what the voice's reaction was to that. Okay? Why would a hallucination care about the 23rd Psalm or religion or the person reading the Bible? Why would they care? It wouldn't. These things, if they're running patterns, they can't be a hallucination. Hallucinations don't run patterns. They're random. They're all over the place. Psychiatry and the big pharma wants you to believe that they're hallucinations and that the only cure is their toxic drugs. And behind that, if we look at it, it's psychiatry and big pharma that are running Western mental health system right now. Okay, let's look at their track record. These are the people who are over the Western mental health system, and what it is it's just a drug-fueled merry-go-round where these people are giving massive amounts of these toxic drugs, okay? And they're not being cured of anything. These drugs only tamp down symptoms. So let's look at how these people are doing. Okay, the high priest of the Western Mental Health Center, the system, the psychiatrist, over 3 million people in the U.S., or 1% of the population of the U.S. is considered schizophrenic. Okay, what they did, the NIMH, they wanted to make it look like they were treating or searching for an answer for schizophrenia. What they did is manipulated the statistics of the incidence of schizophrenia down to a mere dribble, so to make it look like they were paying for more research than they actually were. These people do not want a cure for schizophrenia. They're making $14.54 billion in 2021, which is expected to reach $15.5 billion by 2022. Worldwide sales of antipsychotic drugs. They cure absolutely nothing. All they do is tamp down symptoms. They sedate the schizophrenic. Now, by doing that, well, like I was saying, the voices are energetic. They're not physical. The mind is physical, or the brain is physical. So what they're doing is drugging the brain. They're sedating the brain. They're sedating the body. So these patients are less upset. But soon as they stop taking these drugs, the schizophrenic voices come right back. These voices, they run patterns. Okay, they run 23 patterns that we've found. Okay? If they run patterns, they can't be hallucinations. Let's take a look at how bad this system is. Neither big pharma or psychiatry know what causes schizophrenia. They made up causes because they needed something. They were afraid of looking like fools. So they made up the causes. First, they blamed it on mothers, saying, oh, mothers did something. They treated their children this way or that way, and that caused schizophrenia. This is back in the 50s, I think it was. People could see, well, the mothers didn't do anything. I mean, what's going on with that? I mean, you could see this. They could see it. So what they had to do was kick this up into an area where it couldn't be verified by the common man, by psychiatrists, by psychologists, by the vast majority of the human race. So they started preaching, well, it's a genetic disorder. And they got away with that for years. I mean, decades probably. until, a small group of geneticists decided to undertake the problem, said, hey, we don't see any schizophrenic gene. So then they started preaching, oh, well, it's a series of different genes that are going wrong. So they're making it as complicated and as obtuse as they possibly can. So the average person, the vast majority of the population, can't disprove what they're saying. You got to be a geneticist to disprove it. So the geneticists did disprove it. They said, we can't find a schizophrenic gene. We can't find contributing genes that are a marker for schizophrenia. So they had to come up with something else. So what they came up with was the biochemical imbalance theory. Okay. So that was a myth also. It was made up by one of the drug companies, Eli Lilly, back in the 70s when they came out with Prozac. They needed something to explain why their drugs worked. So they said, well, okay, the voices are they're caused by a biochemical imbalance. They believed that from the start. They had no evidence at the time. They didn't have any evidence when they decreed this, but they came out with it, and it was a total lie. I noticed that when I was working in the state hospital, that something was odd with that, because even though that we were taught in graduate school that schizophrenia and depression and anxiety were all caused by some kind of chemical imbalance, when I watched what psychiatrists were actually doing, they didn't give any kind of pretest to find out what the imbalance was or how far the imbalance was out of balance. Never. They just went into their bag of drugs. The patient was in there. They interviewed him for 20 minutes, half hour at the most, and they go, well, okay, let's try this. Without any lab tests, without any kind of functional or objective test at all. They didn't have one. It didn't exist. But yet they're telling the population of this planet that this is a chemical imbalance, and they have no evidence for it whatsoever. They got away with that for another decade, making it look like they knew what they were doing and what they were talking about. It was a complete lie.
Let's pause here for a minute and hold where you're going with that, with the psychiatrist quote you're going to make. First of all, you have a fantastic video on your channels regarding all this. When I first heard you, this was the very first thing I wanted to get you on with, was the psychological psyop that has gone down with big pharmaceutical companies and the field of psychology, and that they were making up all these diagnoses to push the medical compounds and all this that created the world we're living in now and where we are now, which is a highly medicated place. At least we're in the United States, so we're going to just talk here, but I think you can address how far and wide this is. And I can't help but notice, and I did not want to let this go too far before we got into this conversation, that 23rd Psalm and then 23 patterns to the voices and the DNA strand of 23. So I see these connections, and I wonder about any kind of manipulation through the power of numbers and through these kinds of manipulations that move through our modern culture on a deeper level, say on more of a controlled network-wide level. And the rebranding of some of this now with DID, as we see, dissociative disorder, that used to be thrown upon schizophrenia, is something that it seems like they're trying to shake the schizophrenic stigma and move it into dissociative disorder, DID, and now people, as usual, are wearing these tags proudly. I wanted to interject that because before we get into what you discovered these voices are, and as you were introducing us to this psychological psyop around our world, which really we should now, I think more people should question when they're wearing these badges, I have ADHD, I have this and that, because you've noticed it's become a thing for the modern generation to just say this stuff proudly. They almost use it as an excuse. Oh, I'm sorry, just forgive me, it's my ADHD, or whatever, I'm compulsive and all this. So the quote you were bringing in, going into this malarkey with the psychological community in bed with pharmakia. So you were, and I bring us back to bringing a quote from some psychiatrist about this exact subject.
Yeah, well, the medical system was taken over in like 1910 by the Carnegie Foundation with something called the Flexner Report. What they actually did was they bought off the U.S. Congress and made it illegal for any medical school to graduate medical doctors that didn't go through a pharmacological curriculum. Okay, so basically, if the medical schools weren't teaching pharmacology, then they couldn't graduate doctors. Okay, and they made a law. They paid off Congress and made a law that this was the effect. And everything went out at that point. The electrochemical stuff that Tesla was doing, naturopathy,
yes,
acupuncture, all other forms of treatment for mental disorders were relegated to the trash. They called them quacks. Anybody who practiced anything other than pharmacological medicine was a quack.
And that term's still out there.
Yep. So they made it a law, and that was passed by the pharmaceutical industries. They bought off the Congress, and they're running. There's like 3 lobbyists, pharmaceutical lobbyists, for every member of Congress.
It's criminal.
They're still doing this, so it's allowed them to get away with what they just got away with. The friggin' COVID stuff. And then you see Pfizer still advertising on TV for COVID vaccines after 700 million people, or I heard between 700 million and 1 billion people have died from the vaccines.
And it's just getting started, Jerry. It's a travesty. While we're here, let's look at the idea of the talking therapy that certainly Jung, and he's the only one I actually admire, really pushed forward. Of course, he was pushing it forward with Freud, and there are other people in the mix here. Do you recognize the work Carl Gustav Jung did as far as trying to mitigate away from what became psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and all that now? Because that's not the way of the traditional path that he was trudging forward.
Jung at least recognized that there was some spiritual something to what was going on.
Yeah.
Freud didn't. He didn't want to go anywhere near that.
Yeah.
It scared him.
Freud was not a mystic. Jung was.
No, he wasn't. And psychology and psychiatry and social work are also spiritually devoid. I spent 4 years undergraduate psychology, 2 years in counseling, and I got a graduate degree in that, and then 2 years in a PhD program. They were the most spiritually devoid programs that I've ever been in my life. I had to read something outside of their curriculum just to keep myself sane.
Yeah.
So the answer isn't in their psychotherapies. I mean, I haven't seen one of them that actually worked very well. The only one I've seen that worked at all was something called the Mace Energy Method.
Yes.
Okay. And it is an energetic psychotherapy. Um, it takes the spirit into account. It takes the mind into account. And psychiatry and psychology don't deal with the mind.
With this, though, and the only reason I brought in Jung is because he was on a spiritual path, and he was desperately trying to remain critical in the scientific field, and we probably wouldn't know who he was if he didn't trudge forward trying to remain trying not to be a complete outsider. And so this is what's so tricky with his writing. I've read his entire library. The thing I do when I read is I look at their indices and I start reading those books, and I try to get to what is this person saying, so you can read between the lines. And that became very apparent to me, that he was saying this field is moving away from a spiritual component, and we need to watch out for that. And
Yes.
then here we are all these years later with the work you've done, and I view you very highly now that I've discovered you. You're doing incredible work, and at great peril, I'm sure. But this spiritual component that's happening, and you're up against the big wall that Jung was trying to warn against, and that was part of his separation from Freud, whom I have no respect for. It's amazing where we are now, and we could see in the last 4 years this mass event, this mass trauma event and experiment, how deeply these institutions have been embedded into the trauma that's going on in the collective, and how easily it seems the psyop of the psychological and pharmaceutical marriage has worked on the public. Everyone wants to believe. Everyone listens to these monsters. And I do believe, Jerry, these are all possessed people from the top down controlling this system. These demons that these so-called schizophrenic people are being contacted by, these demons are controlling the system. And right now where we are, they seem to be in a majority. This is just my personal opinion and observation, looking out into the world, talking to a lot of people, and this can tie into targeted individuals and all that we start getting into the electric warfare aspect of it. But do you see this in a similar way? Do you see that the system is now, it seemingly is controlled by these entities?
Yeah, and I got the evidence here too. So what I have in front of me is the patterns that the schizophrenic voices run. Now, I'm going to quickly go through a number of them, not all of them, and watch how they completely match the garbage that is coming out of the mainstream media and the deep state right now. I mean, there's a one-to-one correlation between what the mainstream media and the deep state and the Democratic Party are brainwashing the people of this country with, and the world really.
Yes.
And what the patterns of these voices are. Okay. So I got like 23 patterns here that these voices run. And anybody who works with schizophrenics, has schizophrenics in their family, can see these for themselves. They're not hidden in genetics or biological imbalance crap that you can't check out for yourself. You can see these for yourself. And if the voices are running patterns, they're not hallucinations. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
Okay? And one of the first patterns I discovered was negativity. These voices are consistently, irrevocably negative. They say virtually nothing positive. What holds them on such a negative trajectory? Something does. Some force holds them on that trajectory and keeps them from going random. Being neutral or being positive. No, they're consistently negative. And what I'm saying with regard to this, I mean, I've worked with patients from Georgia to Arizona, and now I'm working with people all over the world. These patterns are the same. They run the same patterns in Georgia as they do in Arizona, as they do all these countries I'm working with in the world. These patterns are the same. They don't change. Okay. The second pattern, as we talked about, they're anti-religious. They can't stand church. They can't stand the 23rd Psalm. You don't believe me? Take your schizophrenic son to church and watch what happens. They foster and create negative emotion. They're constantly saying stuff that causes a generation of negative emotional energy. That's what they feed off of. They are parasites. And you ask any schizophrenic how much energy he has before the voices attack him and how much energy they have after the voices attack, and they will tell you after the voices come, their energy level's drained. They're down to nothing. These things are invisible, parasitic entities. We are not the top of the food chain. They are feeding off of us. And they don't just get the schizophrenics, they get all of us. I mean, all of us has been, walking down the sidewalk, and then all of a sudden this horrible thought comes into your mind to whack the guy in front of you or jump off a bridge or turn your car into traffic. Yeah. Where did that thought come from? It didn't come from you. You know it doesn't belong to you. Everybody's experienced that. That's them. Where do thoughts come from? We're all taught from the time we are children that any thought that appears in our head belongs to us. That's far from correct. Our thoughts don't come from us. They come from outside us. They come from negative places. They come from positive places. Like Swedenborg said, they come from heaven or they come from hell. Consider this. That voice that you have running in your head all the time that's always criticizing you and everybody else, it's constantly running. You're constantly hearing this internal dialogue running in your head. Okay? It's talking to you. If that's you, then who's listening?
Oh, man.
It's you that's listening.
Yes.
That voice is not you. That voice wasn't there when you were born. It has appeared since then.